heavy oak door didn't slam. It clicked shut with a finality that vibrated in my teeth. On the desk between us lay the paper, the red ink of the F, looking less like a grade and more like a laceration. This wasn't just a failed exam. It was the end of my scholarship, the end of the only future I had calculated. Outside, the hallway fluorescent light buzzed at a frequency that usually made my skin crawl. But in here, the silence was absolute. Dr. Hazel Brancher didn't look angry, though. She looked curious. And that was a variable I hadn't factored in. To understand why that silence felt like a physical weight, you have to understand the noise I live in. Getting to her office that afternoon had been a gauntlet. The rain was a relentless tactile assault, hitting my skin like cold needles. The metro ride was a cacophony of screeching brakes and overlapping conversations that cut through my noise-canceling headphones. By the time I reached the humanities building, I was running on the fumes of my masking ability. For 8 hours a day, I manually operate the controls of a normal human interaction simulator, making eye contact, suppressing the urge to rock, nodding when voices sound like drills. It is an exhausting performance, a constant calculation of social physics that leaves me hollowed out. The effort of appearing neurotypical is a tax I pay with my sanity, and today, facing the failure of my academic career, I was overdrawn. But Dr. Brancher's study was a vacuum in the center of the storm. The moment I stepped across the threshold, the sensory profile changed completely. The air here didn't smell like damp wool and exhaust. It smelled of old binding glue, ozone, and a specific, expensive tea, Lapsang Souchong, smoky and deep. The chaotic visual noise of the campus, with its flashing screens and rushing crowds, was replaced by the ordered geometry of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The lighting was low, amber-hued from desk lamps, rather than the harsh overhead fluorescence that usually triggered my migraines. It was a space curated for focus, a stark contrast to the sensory anarchy outside. My fixation on Dr. Brancher wasn't a standard undergraduate crush. It was a categorization project. I had mapped her the way I mapped the subway lines. I knew that she tapped her fountain pen against her chin exactly 3 times when she was considering a counter-argument. I knew the cadence of her lectures, the precise rhythm of her pauses, which were always 4 seconds long, designed to let the silence do the heavy lifting. I had memorized the way her voice dropped an octave when she was passionate about a text, a resonant frequency that I could feel in my chest. She was a pattern I wanted to decode, a complex system that made sense in a world that usually didn't. Her predictability was a balm to my chaotic nervous system. She sat behind her desk now, a fortress of mahogany that usually separated the faculty from the students. But today, the distance felt different. I stood there, wet coat dripping onto her Persian rug, waiting for the lecture on academic responsibility. I was vibrating with the effort to keep my hands still, to stop them from flapping in distress. The red letter on the paper was a glaring error in my programming, a failure of translation between my brain and her expectations. I braced myself for the verbal dismantling, for the disappointment that usually accompanied my failures. I watched her hands. They were pale, strong, unadorned by rings. She picked up the paper, not with disgust, but with a slow, deliberate movement that caught my attention. She didn't speak immediately. She let the silence stretch, testing the tension of it. Then she did something that severed the tether to the outside world completely. She reached past the paper, past the red grade, and flipped the brass lock on her door. The click was loud, sharp, and instantaneous. It was the sound of the world narrowing down to just this room, just this scent of smoke and old paper, and just her. The buzzing of the hallway lights vanished, replaced by the thrum of my own pulse in my ears. "Sit down," she said. It wasn't a suggestion, but it lacked the sharpness of a command. It was simply a statement of where my body needed to be. I lowered myself into the leather chair opposite her desk. The leather was cool, slippery, and smelled of polish. It was a jarring texture against my damp jeans. I focused on that sensation, the cold slide of the material, because looking at the paper on the desk was physically painful. The failure wasn't a result of laziness. That would have been easier to process. Laziness is a choice. This was a fundamental incompatibility between my mind and her question. The prompt had been a single, terrifying sentence. Discuss what the protagonist refuses to acknowledge about their own desire. To a neurotypical student, this is an invitation to explore themes and emotional arcs. To me, it was a request to quantify the invisible. My brain requires concrete data. It craves syntax, historical context, etymology. I can dismantle a sentence diagram down to its atomic weight. But asking me to interpret unacknowledged desire is like asking a calculator to describe the taste of blue. I had panicked. I had retreated into the safety of facts. I wrote 6 pages analyzing the frequency of modal verbs in the text. I created a statistical model of the character's hesitation markers. I turned a question about human longing into a spreadsheet. Dr. Brancher tapped the paper with a single manicured fingernail. The sound was a light tick against the desktop, but in the silence of the room, it sounded like a gavel. "You memorized the text," she said, her voice low and terrifyingly calm. She didn't look at the paper. She looked at me. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and unblinking. "You know every word, every punctuation mark, every historical allusion. Technically, your analysis is flawless." She paused, letting the praise hang there for a second before cutting the thread. "But you didn't answer the question. You treated the characters like equations to be solved, not people to be understood. You stripped the humanity out of it until all that was left was grammar." The critique hit me in the center of my chest. It wasn't just about the paper. It was an indictment of how I moved through the world. "You stripped the humanity out of it." She was grading my survival mechanism, the armor I wore to endure the noise outside, and telling me it was failing. I felt the shutdown initiating. It starts in my throat, a tightening of the vocal cords that feels like a physical blockage. The connection between my brain and my mouth severed. I wanted to explain. I wanted to tell her that I didn't know how to write about desire because I spent my entire life trying to suppress my own wants to fit into a world that found me too much, too loud, too intense. But the words were trapped behind a wall of static. My verbal processing center went offline. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. Just a sharp intake of breath that sounded too loud in the small room. The mask crumbled. Usually I channel my excess energy into invisible fidgets, wiggling my toes inside my boots, clenching my jaw. But the distress was too high now. I lost control of the simulator. My right hand, resting on my knee, began to move. My thumb rubbed hard against the rough denim seam of my jeans, back and forth, a rapid, rhythmic friction. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was a self-soothing stim, a way to ground myself in physical sensation when the emotional input became overwhelming. It was a blatant signal of my neurodivergence, a flag I never waved in public. I stared at the corner of her desk, unable to meet her eyes, waiting for the dismissal, waiting for her to tell me to get out, to tell me I didn't belong in her department, didn't belong in this university. The rhythmic sound of my thumb on denim filled the silence, a frantic metronome counting down the seconds until my expulsion. But the dismissal didn't come. The lecture didn't continue. Dr. Brancher stopped speaking about grades entirely. The silence in the room shifted. It was no longer the heavy, judgmental silence of a professor waiting for an excuse. It changed texture, becoming thicker, charged. I saw movement in my peripheral vision. She wasn't reaching for the red pen. She wasn't reaching for the door handle. She was leaning forward, invading the sterile zone of the desk, her attention moving away from the paper and fixing entirely on my trembling hand. Dr. Brancher stood up. The sound of her chair scraping against the floorboards was a sharp interruption to the rhythm of my panic. But she didn't move toward the door to usher me out. She didn't move toward the bookshelf to retrieve a remedial syllabus. She rounded the corner of the mahogany desk, invading the neutral territory that usually separated us. I stopped breathing. My thumb froze against the seam of my jeans. She leaned back against the edge of the desk, crossing her ankles, bringing her eye level down to mine. And then I saw it, the variable I hadn't calculated. The look. Her professional persona, that immaculate, armored shell of the academic elite, didn't crack. It simply dissolved. The eyes that usually scanned my papers for comma splices were now scanning my face with a terrifying intensity. The clinical detachment was gone, replaced by a dark, focused hunger that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin. It wasn't the look of a teacher disappointed in a student. It was the look of a predator who had finally decided to stop stalking and step into the light. It was analytical, yes, but she wasn't analyzing my thesis anymore. She was analyzing my response time. "You're vibrating," she observed softly. She reached out. I flinched, a reflex born of a lifetime of expecting correction. But her hand didn't strike. It settled on my shoulder. It wasn't a tentative pat, it was heavy. She pressed down, applying a deep, consistent pressure that grounded me instantly to the chair. To an observer, it might have looked dominant. To me, it was medicinal. The firm, unyielding weight of her hand cut through the static in my brain like a signal jammer. The chaotic buzzing in my nerves quieted down, focused entirely on the single, coherent point of her heat seeping through my damp sweater. "You didn't fail the exam because you lack insight, Miss Reynolds," she murmured, her voice dropping to that resonant frequency that always made my chest ache. Her other hand came up, hovering for a split second before tracing the line of my jaw with the back of her fingers. The contact was electric, a thermal shock against my cold skin. "You failed because you're trying to translate a language you feel too intensely into a language that feels safe. You tried to give me data because you were terrified of giving me the truth." She understood. The realization hit me harder than the grade. She hadn't been marking my errors. She had been cataloging my defenses. She had watched me construct a fortress of logic and syntax, and now she was dismantling it with a single touch. My voice cracked, a broken instrument. "I don't know the rules for this interaction." "There are no rules in this room," she countered. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then snapped back to my eyes, a slow, deliberate trajectory that burned. "You track my movements. You memorize my cadence. You count the seconds of my pauses. Do you think I haven't noticed? Do you think I haven't been tracking you back?" The air between us charged with intent. The hierarchy didn't vanish. It twisted into something sharper. She leaned in. The scent of sandalwood and rain overwhelmed the smell of old paper. It was a sensory flood, but for the first time, I didn't want to block it out. I wanted to drown in it. When her lips brushed mine, it wasn't an explosion. It was an alignment, a correction of coordinates. It was slow, agonizingly deliberate, and focused entirely on the contrast of textures, the softness of her mouth against the tension in mine. She tasted of the smoky tea she drank and the mint she used to hide it. The kiss deepened, and she made a sound low in her throat, a vibration I felt against my own chest as she leaned into me. It was the only sound in the world. My hands, usually so restless, found purchase on the lapels of her blazer. I held on, not to pull her closer, she was already everywhere, but to keep myself from floating away. The relief was narcotic. For the first time all day, for the first time in months, the noise stopped. There was no buzzing light, no screeching metro, no masking. There was just the pressure of her hand on my neck and the terrifying, wonderful reality that the person I had been studying was finally letting me read the source code. She pulled back inches, just enough to breathe, her forehead resting against mine. Her eyes were blown wide, the pupils swallowing the iris, turning the hazel almost black. The F on the desk was forgotten, irrelevant. We had crossed a threshold that no red pen could correct. The lock on the door wasn't keeping the world out anymore. It was sealing us in with a danger we had both just agreed to court. The immediate aftermath wasn't a discussion. We didn't debrief the kiss like a botched lab experiment or apologize for the breach of protocol. Instead, the silence shifted from charged to companionable. Dr. Brancher simply moved. She didn't return to the fortress of her high-backed chair. She pulled a smaller reading chair next to mine, close enough that our knees brushed if either of us shifted. She picked up a book, Virginia Woolf, The Waves, and began to read. This was the first lesson of our new syllabus, parallel play. We existed in the same coordinates, engaging in separate tasks, tethered only by the proximity of our bodies. I pulled out my laptop to rewrite the failed paper, and for the first time in weeks, the cursor didn't blink like a mockery. The buzzing in my head was gone, replaced by the rhythmic turning of her pages. We formalized the arrangement before I left that evening. On university letterhead, it was documented as intensive remedial tutoring, designed to salvage my scholarship eligibility. It was a bureaucratic fiction, a paper shield constructed to satisfy the department head and explain the hours I would spend behind her closed door. But we both knew the curriculum had nothing to do with literary criticism. I was there to be grounded, and she was there to be seen without the armor. Categorizing this new relationship became my private obsession. It defied every social script I had ever memorized. We weren't dating. Dating implies public acknowledgement, shared dinners in noisy restaurants, and a linear trajectory toward cohabitation. We weren't friends. Friends don't look at each other with that terrifying, consuming hunger that feels like starvation. And we certainly weren't just teacher and student anymore. It was a taxonomy of two, a classified ecosystem where the only rule was that we needed each other to function. It was terrifying because I couldn't predict the outcome. I couldn't graph the variables. But the relief of being known outweighed the fear of the unknown. The sessions followed a strict, unspoken sensory protocol. Tuesdays and Thursdays, 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. The door locked, the lights dimmed to that specific amber hue that didn't hurt my eyes. My favorite moments were auditory. Dr. Brancher discovered that her reading voice, that low, resonant timbre, acted as a regulator for my nervous system. She would read aloud, usually dense theory or modernist poetry, and the meaning of the words mattered less than the physical vibration of them in the small room. It was an auditory stim, a repetitive, soothing input that allowed my brain to unclench. There were physical protocols, too. I learned that she wasn't the ice queen the campus rumors described. She was tactile, seeking pressure just as much as I did. On the bad days, when the city noise had been particularly violent, I would sit on the rug, leaning against the sofa, and she would lie down, resting her head in my lap. The weight of her head was a physical anchor, a heavy, warm reality that kept me from floating away into dissociation. I would weave my fingers through her hair, counting the strands, mapping the topography of her scalp. In those moments, the power dynamic flattened completely. She wasn't the professor holding my future in her hands. She was just Hazel, needing a quiet place to rest her mind. But the clock always ran out. The transition back to reality was a physical shock. Stepping out of her study and into the hallway felt like depressurizing too quickly. The harsh fluorescent lights of the corridor would hit my retinas like a physical slap, and the hum of the vending machine down the hall would return, drilling into my skull. I had to reassemble the mask, piece by piece, before I reached the elevator. I had to lock the hunger away, smooth my expression into neutral student deference, and walk out into the cold city rain as if my entire world hadn't just been rewritten in a room smelling of sandalwood and secrets. There is a specific kind of dissonance that comes from sitting in a lecture hall with 200 other students, watching the person who held you while you fell apart the night before now discuss Victorian repression with clinical detachment. I sat in row 8, seat 4, my fixed coordinate, and watched Dr. Brancher pace the stage. To the room, she was an authority figure, a distant intellectual monolith draped in charcoal. To me, she was a collection of sensory memories: the weight of her head, the smell of lapsang tea, the rough texture of her palms. I watched her hands gesture at the screen, and my brain overlaid the image with the memory of those same hands tracing the vertebrae of my spine. The disconnect was a vertigo that made the room tilt. I had to grip the edge of my desk, digging my fingernails into the laminate to keep from feeling like I was floating away. The public version of her was louder, her voice projected for the back row, stripping away the intimate resonance I had claimed. But then, the code began. It started subtly. We had developed a lexicon, a secret language built from the debris of our late-night conversations. During a lecture on narrative structure, she paused, tapping the podium 3 times, her thinking beat. "Notice," she said, her voice amplified but steady, "how the protagonist uses silence not as an absence, but as a structural, load-bearing wall." My breath hitched. Load-bearing wall. It was a phrase I had used 2 nights ago to describe why I needed my noise-canceling headphones. It was a citation of my internal world broadcasted to the undergraduate body. She didn't look at me when she said it. She was too disciplined for that. But I saw the microscopic tightening at the corner of her mouth. It was a signal, a frequency tuned specifically to my receiver. She was acknowledging our shared reality in the middle of a public performance. Maintaining the mask in these moments was both agony and a high-stakes thrill. I couldn't react. I couldn't smile. I couldn't let my foot tap in recognition. I had to remain a blank slate, just another student taking notes, while my blood ran hot with the secret. I spent the entire 50 minutes analyzing her micro-expressions, running a constant diagnostic for regret. Did she look tired? Was the glance she threw toward the clock a sign of boredom or anticipation? I was terrified that the daylight would burn away the intimacy, that the Dr. Brancher persona would eventually cannibalize Hazel. The danger peaked on a Tuesday afternoon. I was leaving the department office, distracted, adjusting the strap of my bag, when I rounded the corner and nearly collided with her. It was a blind spot in the architecture. We stopped inches apart. For a fraction of a second, the momentum of our bodies almost bridged the gap. Her hand twitched upward, an aborted reflex to steady me, or perhaps to touch me. The air between us instantly compressed, thick with the sudden proximity. We were in the busiest corridor of the wing, yet the silence of the study expanded around us like a force field. I smelled the sandalwood and rain, sharp and immediate. My body, conditioned by weeks of our arrangement, leaned forward automatically. "Watch your step," she said. Her voice was clipped, professional, but her eyes were dilated, black holes swallowing the hallway light. She looked at my mouth for a dangerous, lingering second before stepping around me. The magnetic pull felt like physical resistance, a current trying to weld us together under the security cameras. I stood there, shaking, realizing that the compartmentalization was failing. The walls we had built were leaking. Later that evening, an email notification lit up my phone. It wasn't a private message. It was a departmental blast. Invitation to the annual faculty-student gala, a sensory nightmare social event involving champagne and perfumes. But at the bottom, there was a personal addendum, invisible to the uninitiated. Attendance is mandatory for scholarship recipients. It was a summon. She was calling me into the open, inviting me to stand in the glare of the chandelier light, right where the danger was sharpest. The faculty club was a sensory torture chamber disguised as a celebration. The acoustics were designed to amplify the worst frequencies: the high-pitched shatter of crystal flutes clinking, the roar of overlapping conversations, and the scrape of wooden chairs against parquet floors. The air was thick, a suffocating soup of expensive perfumes, heavy musks clashing with sharp florals, and the metallic tang of gin. I stood near a potted fern, clutching a glass of sparkling water like a talisman, trying to keep my breathing even. My suit was a sensory prison, the stiff fabric digging into my neck, the tag scratching against my lower back with every micro movement. I was vibrating with the effort to not bolt for the exit. This was the price of the scholarship: performing gratitude in a hellscape of small talk where every smile felt like a baring of teeth. Then I found my North Star. Dr. Brancher stood near the marble fireplace, wearing emerald velvet that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. It was a deep forest green that clashed beautifully with the stark black and white of the room, a texture I immediately wanted to map with my hands. She wasn't looking at me. She was nodding at the dean, her expression the perfect mask of politely bored intellect. But her presence was a localized gravity field. Just knowing she was there, 30 feet away, acted as a dampener on the noise. She was the anchor. I focused on the line of her jaw, the same jaw I had traced 2 nights ago, and the chaotic input of the room began to organize itself. She didn't hover or acknowledge me, but she had positioned herself in my direct line of sight. "I'm surprised you haven't dissolved yet." The voice came from my left, sharp and sudden. It was Marcus, a grad student with ambition that radiated off him like heat. He stepped into my personal space, bringing the smell of scotch and expensive cologne with him. "You usually avoid the herd." "Mandatory," I managed, keeping the response monosyllabic to conserve energy. "You've been spending a lot of time in the East Wing," he observed, his eyes narrowing as he followed my gaze toward Hazel. "Her office light is on late, Tuesdays and Thursdays. I've seen you leaving." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I had calculated the risk of faculty oversight, but I hadn't factored in the surveillance of jealous peers. "Remedial work," I lied, the word tasting like copper. "My thesis needed restructuring." Marcus laughed, a short, barking sound that grated on my nerves. "Right, remedial. You're gunning for the fellowship, aren't you? Trying to absorb her genius by osmosis? It's intense, even for you. But be careful. She eats students like you for breakfast." He didn't see it. The realization washed over me, cool and clarifying. He saw my obsession, my late hours, my fixation on her patterns, and he interpreted it through the only lens he understood: academic ruthlessness. He thought I was a sycophant climbing the ladder. He didn't know I was a lover trying to find solid ground. My neurodivergence, usually a liability, was acting as the perfect camouflage. The intensity of my focus was being misread as careerism. They looked at the F on my paper and saw a student trying to recover. They didn't see the woman recovering me. It was the perfect alibi. I looked up, needing confirmation. Across the sea of black ties and sequins, Hazel turned. She stopped mid-sentence, ignoring the donor speaking to her. Her eyes locked onto mine with the precision of a sniper. It wasn't a casual scan. It was a diagnostic. "Are you holding up?" her gaze asked. "Is the noise too much?" I blinked once, a slow, deliberate shudder. "I'm okay." The corner of her mouth lifted, a microscopic shift that no one else would have caught. In that second, the room went silent. The clinking glasses and the laughter faded into background radiation. The glance was louder than a shout, a tether pulling taut across the gala floor, proving that even here, in the glare, we were still locked in the study. The email didn't come from Hazel. It came from Dr. Eris Thorne, the department head, with a subject line that made my stomach drop. Academic Integrity Review. The meeting wasn't in a sanctuary. It was in a glass-walled office that smelled of chemical lemon polish and administrative anxiety. Dr. Thorne sat behind a desk that was too clean, holding a printout of my transcript like it was a piece of contaminated evidence. "We have a statistical anomaly," he said, tapping the paper. He didn't look angry. He looked bored, which was worse. Bureaucracy is always bored by the lives it dismantles. You went from a failing grade in Dr. Brancher's seminar to the highest marks in the cohort in 6 weeks. Remedial tutoring is designed to salvage a passing grade, Miss Reynolds, not to produce a prodigy overnight. He wasn't accusing us of sleeping together. He was accusing us of academic fraud. He thought she was writing my papers. The irony was bitter. She hadn't written a word. She had just quieted the noise so I could think. But I couldn't explain that. I couldn't tell him that the remedial work was actually just her reading modernist poetry while I sat on her rug until my hands stopped shaking. It wasn't the expulsion I feared. It was the severing. If they audited the sessions would stop. The door would stay locked. The silence would end. I left the office vibrating with a frequency of panic I hadn't felt in months. I went straight to the East Wing, needing the heavy oak door, needing the smell of Lopsang tea to ground me. But when I reached the corridor, the door was already closed. And for the first time in weeks, it was locked tight from the inside. I knocked. A soft, rhythmic tap. Our code. The door opened, but only a crack. Hazel stood there, but Dr. Brancher was the one looking back at me. The transformation was terrifying. The softness around her eyes was gone, replaced by a glacial sheet of professional distance. She was wearing her armor again. High collar, severe bun, lips pressed into a thin line. She looked at me not like I was her anchor, but like I was a liability she had failed to mitigate. Her eyes were walls. "We cannot meet," she said. Her voice was stripped of the resonant timbre I loved. It was flat, clipped, and loud enough for the hallway to hear. Dr. Thorne has raised concerns about the appearance of favoritism. Until the review is concluded, all remedial sessions are suspended. She didn't wait for my response. She didn't offer a secret hand squeeze or a signal. She closed the door. The click of the latch wasn't the comforting sound of safety anymore. It was the sound of a seal breaking on an airlock, ejecting me back into the void. The withdrawal was immediate and violent. Without the anchor of the study, the city rushed back in to fill the space she had vacated. The walk to the metro that night was a sensory nightmare. The rain felt sharper, like ice shards against my skin. The streetlights glared with a hostile brightness that triggered a migraine instantly, and the noise of the traffic was a physical assault that left me gasping for air. I had lost my noise-canceling signal. I was unmoored, drifting back into the chaos without a tether. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, hoping, praying for a code, a citation, anything from her. But it wasn't Hazel. It was the automated admin system. Notice, final administrative review scheduled for Friday, 4 p.m. Attendance mandatory. She let me in one last time, she said, just to explain the logic. The study was cold, the heating was off, or maybe she was just projecting a localized frost. She stood behind the mahogany desk, rebuilding the fortress I had spent weeks dismantling. "This is a necessary correction," she said, her voice stripped of all warmth. "Dr. Thorne is right. The dependency is unhealthy. You are a student. I am a professor. We have allowed a breach of protocol that endangers your entire trajectory." She was using the department head voice. She was citing the handbook, listing the variables of risk and liability. She talked about power imbalances and ethical boundaries, as if they were physical walls she could hide behind. She was trying to bore me into a breakup. She was trying to use logic to sever a connection that was entirely emotional. But she forgot who she was talking to. She forgot that I don't process social lies. I process data. And her data was flawed. "That is a logical fallacy," I interrupted. My voice was flat, devoid of the pleading tone she probably expected. I stepped forward, right up to the edge of the rug. "You are framing this as a protection measure for me. You claim the arrangement is a threat to my future. But the empirical evidence contradicts that thesis. Since we began the sessions, my cortisol levels have dropped. My grades have improved by 40%. My sensory overload incidents have decreased from 5 times a week to 0. Therefore, the arrangement is not the threat. The administrative review is the threat. You are not protecting me from yourself, Hazel. You are protecting yourself from the truth." She flinched. It was a small movement, a tightening of the eyes, but I caught it. It was a crack in the porcelain. "You don't understand the optics," she hissed, gripping the edge of her desk until her knuckles turned white. "You don't understand how the world sees this. They see a predator and prey. They see me taking advantage of a vulnerable student." "I am not vulnerable in this room," I stated, stepping closer, ignoring the invisible barrier she was trying to erect. "Out there? In the hallway with the lights? In the gala with the noise? Yes, I am vulnerable. I am raw nerves and panic. But in here, with the door locked, I am whole. You don't see a diagnosis when you look at me. You don't see a set of symptoms to be managed. You see me. And you are the only person in this entire city who knows how to be quiet enough to let me exist." She looked away, staring at the spine of a book on the shelf, refusing to meet my eyes. The silence that followed wasn't the comfortable silence of our reading sessions. It was brittle and sharp. "It doesn't matter. It has to end. You need to leave. Tell me you don't want it," I said. It was a gamble. It was the most dangerous variable I had ever played. Don't cite the handbook. Don't talk about Dr. Thorne. Look at me right now and state as a fact that you do not want me here. Tell me that when I leave, you don't feel the silence turn heavy. Tell me you don't wait for the knock. Tell me you prefer the solitude of this office to the weight of my head in your lap." She turned back to me, her mouth open to form the lie, to deliver the final blow that would send me away. But the words died in her throat. She looked at me, really looked at me, and the Ice Queen disintegrated. The terrified woman underneath broke through. "I can't," she whispered, the sound wrecked and honest. "God, I can't." She rounded the desk, abandoning the fortress. She didn't stop until she was inches from me, her hands reaching out to grip my arms, not to push me away, but to hold herself up. "I hate the noise too," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I hate the posturing. I hate the department politics. You think you're the only one who needs the quiet? You think you're the only one who needs to be seen? She pulled me into her, burying her face in the crook of my neck, breathing in the scent of my damp coat like it was oxygen. Her composure was gone, shattered by the weight of her own confession. The logic had failed. The data was undeniable. We were both drowning in the expectations of the university, and we were the only raft the other had. We stood there, clinging to each other in the dim light, the administrative review forgotten, the red pen on the desk forgotten. There was only the shared, desperate knowledge that we couldn't go back to being strangers. We didn't surrender to the review board, but we didn't ignore the data either. We simply recalculated the variables of our interaction to change the outcome. The solution wasn't to end the connection, it was to restructure the interface. We applied the same rigor to our relationship that we applied to literary theory. If the power dynamic was the obstacle, we would remove the power dynamic entirely. The next morning, I filed a formal request to transfer my thesis supervision to Dr. Eris Thorne himself. It was a strategic masterstroke, placing myself directly under the scrutiny of the man trying to separate us, rendering his suspicion moot. It meant I wouldn't step foot in Hazel's office for the remaining 6 weeks of the term. It meant the heavy oak door remained shut to me during business hours. It was a tactical silence, a necessary void we had to endure to secure the future, a calculation of pain versus reward. Those 6 weeks were a study in sensory deprivation. I walked the campus like a ghost, seeing her only in the hallways, passing like a stranger, though the magnetic pull between us was strong enough to distort the air. I kept my head down, submitted my final papers to Thorne, defended my thesis with a cold, mechanical precision that bored him into approval, and watched the semester bleed out into winter break. The moment the final grade was posted, an A that felt sterile without her red ink on it, the chain of command shattered. I was no longer her student. I was a civilian. And civilians are allowed to visit private residences without triggering an ethics committee review. Hazel's apartment was the physical manifestation of the peace I had been chasing. Located on the top floor of a pre-war building, it was far enough above the street level that the city noise was reduced to a distant, rhythmic hum, soothing and constant, like the ocean. The lighting was entirely amber, vintage lamps with thick shades that cast a warm, diffused glow. There were no fluorescent buzzes here to trigger a migraine. The floors were covered in thick, heavy rugs that absorbed sound and felt grounding under my bare feet. It was a space designed for two people who experienced the world as too loud. The air always smelled faintly of that smoky lapsang tea and the beeswax candles she burned to neutralize the city grit that usually clung to my skin. Our new dynamic wasn't built on grand romantic gestures or the frantic heat of a forbidden affair. It was built on the profound luxury of parallel existence. We spent our evenings in the living room, occupying the same coordinate system, but engaged in separate orbits. I would sit on the floor, organizing my collection of sea glass by texture and opacity, a stim that usually required total isolation to perform without shame. Hazel would sit on the velvet sofa a few feet away, grading papers or reading, her presence a steady, warm weight in my peripheral vision. We didn't need to speak. The silence wasn't empty. It was a shared substance, a protective gel that held us suspended in safety, allowing our nervous systems to finally unclench. Sometimes she would reach down and rest her hand on my shoulder, a heavy, grounding pressure that reminded me I was real. I would lean back against her legs, feeling the hum of her contentment vibrate through the fabric of her lounge pants. It was a domestic intimacy that felt more dangerous, more radical than any illicit office kiss. In the office, we were hiding. Here, we were simply being. We had taken the raw, jagged edges of our neurotypes, her need for control, my need for sensory regulation, and fitted them together like a complex joinery. We hadn't just survived the semester. We had engineered a habitat where we didn't have to mask. We had built a world that finally accommodated the silence we both craved, proving that the variables could be solved if you just changed the equation to prioritize the people over the rules. Looking back at that first paper, the one bleeding with red ink on her mahogany desk, it feels like an artifact from a different timeline. That F wasn't a mark of failure. It was a distress signal that she answered. I often think about the trajectory of that semester, how a moment of academic collapse became the foundation for the only stability I've ever known. The university sees a transcript with a corrected grade, a successful thesis defense, a student who overcame her difficulties. They don't see the real work. They don't see the silent, terrifying labor of dismantling 2 lifetimes of defensive architecture to find a common floor plan where we both fit. Now, our evenings have a different texture. The silence isn't heavy with the threat of expulsion. It's heavy with the weight of a 12-pound knitted blanket she bought because she read that deep pressure helps regulate proprioceptive dysfunction. It's in the steam rising from 2 mugs of Lapsang Souchong, her smoky, expensive blend that I've grown to associate with safety. We sit on the sofa, her legs thrown over mine, the physical barrier of the desk a distant memory. I listen to the rhythm of her breathing, a steady, biological metronome that syncs with my own, slowing my heart rate down to a resting pace that was impossible for me 6 months ago. The sensory profile of my life has shifted from chaos to a curated calm. Hazel isn't the ice queen anymore. That persona hangs in her closet with the charcoal blazers, reserved for board meetings and department heads. Here, in the amber light of the apartment, she is complex, soft, and beautifully direct. She understands that I need literal language. She knows that when I say the lights are too loud, I mean I am in physical pain, and she turns them off without asking for a metaphor. She knows that when I go nonverbal, I'm not angry, I'm just rebooting, and she waits for me on the other side without judgment or impatience. She has become the safe harbor I never thought existed on a map drawn by neurotypical rules. It is a relief so profound it feels like breathing pure oxygen after holding my breath for 20 years. I realized recently that I didn't just pass her seminar. I didn't just learn to deconstruct modernist literature or analyze the syntax of desire. I decoded the most complex human interaction of my life. I solved the variable of intimacy. For years, I thought my neurodivergence made me incompatible with this kind of connection, that I was too rigid, too literal, too much work. But Hazel showed me that my intensity wasn't a bug. It was a feature she needed. She needed someone who saw her patterns, who memorized her cadence, who looked at her not as a boss, but as a person worth mapping. She needed my specific kind of attention, just as much as I needed her specific kind of silence. The final image in my mind isn't the diploma or the gala. It's the door. Not the terrifying door of the admin office, but the heavy door of her study, and now the door of our home. It clicks shut, not to keep the world out, but to keep our shared, precious quiet in. We have created a sanctuary where the noise of the city can't reach us. A space where we don't have to mask, where the only input that matters is the pressure of her hand in mine. The red pen she once used to fail me now sits in a ceramic cup on our shared desk. No longer a weapon of judgment, but a tool we both use to correct the drafts of our life together. If you understand the relief of finding someone who finally quiets the noise, subscribe to follow the rest of the story.